Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you is not the story England wanted you to remember. Behind the portraits, the myths, and the propaganda lies the stench of rot. Henry VIII, the Golden Prince who became the most feared monarch of his age, did not die as a king should. He died swollen, screaming, and abandoned by the very flesh he once used to command empires. And yet, that isn't the darkest truth. The darkest truth is how his death was hidden, buried beneath layers of deception, because the reality of his final days was too grotesque, too humiliating, too dangerous for a kingdom to face. Imagine it, Whitehall Palace, 1547. Winter hangs heavy in the air, but inside the king's chambers, the atmosphere is thicker, suffocating, almost unholy. The curtains are drawn tight, incense burns constantly, and servants enter only with perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. For within that chamber lies not a man, but a collapsing monument of disease and decay. Henry's legs, ulcerated and split open, seeped pus and blood with such a foul odor that even hardened attendants gagged. His body had grown monstrous, perhaps 400 pounds, requiring winches and pulleys to move him. The King of England had become a prisoner of his own flesh, a spectacle of corruption. But don't be fooled into thinking this was merely the breakdown of a human body. No. This was the breakdown of an empire's illusion. For Henry was not just a man, he was a symbol, a weapon, an embodiment of power. His death could not be allowed to look weak. So courtiers whispered lies into the streets, proclamations of strength, declarations that the lion still roared, even as Henry lay trembling, hallucinating, and gasping for breath. To admit his collapse would have been to expose the fragility of the crown itself. And so, even as the king's flesh blackened and burst, his image was carefully guarded, preserved like a holy relic. Behind closed doors, his screams echoed down the stone corridors, a sound no subject was ever meant to hear. The body of a man, but the ghost of a myth. You are not supposed to know this. You were meant to see the paintings, Henry standing tall, broad-shouldered, legs planted wide, defiant, eternal. You were not meant to see him twitching in agony, drooling opium-laced spit, clawing at the sheets as his mind slipped between rage and delirium. That was the truth that had to be buried. The truth that still haunts England's history. To understand the grotesque end of Henry VIII, you must first strip away the myth of the Golden Prince. In his youth, Henry was the embodiment of vitality, a towering figure who could wrestle, hunt, and joust with the finest men in Christendom. His body was his weapon, his charm his shield, and his appetites his engine. He was admired, envied, even worshipped. But power, when fed endlessly, does not elevate a man. It mutates him. What began as vigor twisted into gluttony, paranoia, and cruelty. And by the time death stalked him, Henry had become something monstrous, a body swollen with excess, and a mind cracked by years of unchecked power. His enemies, his wives, his so-called friends, all had felt the sharpened edge of his will. But in the end, the only executioner capable of defeating him was his own flesh. The ulcers that chewed through his legs were not just wounds, they were living graves, festering reminders of decay that could not be disguised. The stench of them was legendary. Diplomats recorded how audiences with the king required the burning of constant fires and incense, yet nothing masked the odor of death that clung to him. His courtiers bowed, but in their silence, they whispered, "The king is already rotting." Think about what that means. The most powerful man in the land, a man who had broken with Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, who had sent queens and lords to the block with the stroke of a pen, reduced to a sweating, bleeding carcass that had to be hauled by mechanical devices like a piece of livestock. This was not only physical suffering. It was symbolic collapse. The king who claimed divine authority could not control the corruption eating him alive. And yet, still, Henry fought. He fought against the truth of his weakness. Against the inevitability of death. Against the knowledge that his enemies waited, circling like vultures. He signed execution orders even when he could barely lift a pen. He raged, he cursed, he demanded loyalty and silence from those who served him. His voice, once thunderous, had grown hoarse, but his will remained venomous. It was as though Henry believed that by sheer force of command, he could outwit the one adversary even kings cannot crush, mortality itself. But mortality has no master. And what followed in those final nights inside Whitehall was not just a king's death. It was the unraveling of power itself, a spectacle so disturbing, it had to be hidden for centuries. In those final weeks of January 1547, the palace itself became a prison of silence. Few were allowed into the royal chamber, and those who were, left broken by what they saw. Imagine the scene, a vast bed draped in dark velvet, shadows dancing across the walls from candle flames, incense clouds thick enough to choke. And at the center, the hulking, misshapen figure of Henry VIII, a body so bloated it had become a fortress of flesh, and yet one crumbling from within. His face was yellowed, his eyes sunken, his breath labored. Servants feared to touch him, not because of reverence, but because his sores and ulcers could rupture at the slightest movement. This was no royal chamber. It was a chamber of decay. And still, the myth had to be protected. Official proclamations told the people that their king was healthy, strong, full of vigor. The truth was a guarded secret, whispered only in locked corridors. The deception was not for Henry's dignity, it was for control. If word spread that the lion was dying, factions would rise, plots would ignite, foreign powers would pounce. England itself could collapse. And so the truth was suppressed, suffocated beneath layers of ceremony and lies. But inside Henry's mind, there was no escape. The opium that dulled his pain also blurred the lines between waking and nightmare. At night, attendants reported his screams echoing through the palace, cries not of a king, but of a hunted animal. He saw them, or believed he did, the faces of the dead. And Bullen, beheaded by his order. Thomas More, burned into memory. Men and women whose blood stained his reign, now returning in silence, staring at him in judgment. He raved, he begged, he cursed. In moments of lucidity, he demanded Catholic rights one day, Protestant affirmations the next. His soul was fractured, tormented by the very faith he had tried to bend to his will. And this is the lesson that no historian dares to tell plainly: Henry VIII was not only dying of disease. He was dying of power. Power is poison when swallowed whole. It isolates, corrodes, and finally consumes. His reign had been built on the illusion that a man could be absolute, untouchable, divine. But here, in the dark heart of Whitehall, reality clawed through the illusion. The King of England was just flesh. Flesh that stank. Flesh that rotted. Flesh that begged for mercy. This is what happens when a man believes himself greater than the forces that shape all men. And Henry, for all his crowns, could not command his own decay. While Henry's body was breaking, the palace was alive with something else: calculation. The king's chamber may have been thick with the smell of rotting flesh, but outside those doors, men were already carving up the future. Courtiers circled like wolves, factions sharpened their knives, and the question on every whispering tongue was not if Henry would die, but when. His son, Edward, was only 9 years old, fragile, uncertain, and easily controlled. Whoever reached the boy first would control the kingdom. This is why Henry's illness was hidden with such desperate intensity. It was not only to protect the illusion of the king's strength, it was to buy time for the most dangerous game in England: succession. The Catholic faction, led by Norfolk, prepared to seize power through tradition and faith. The Protestant faction, led by Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, prepared to claim control through blood ties and ambition. Every cough from the king, every seizure, every moment of silence in his chambers, sent ripples of panic through the palace. The body of Henry VIII was now more than a body. It was a throne, collapsing in slow motion, and every man with ambition wanted a hand on the crown that would fall. Meanwhile, Henry, delirious and fading, still believed he commanded the storm. He signed execution orders in a trembling hand, sealing the fate of men he would never live to see die. He lashed out in bursts of fury, paranoid that betrayal lingered in every shadow. Yet in his silence, in his nightmares, he knew the truth: death had stripped him of power. He had become the weakest man in his kingdom, a bloated prisoner surrounded by attendants sworn to keep his collapse secret. The king who once terrified all of Europe was now terrifying only himself. But understand this: what we are witnessing is not just the death of a king. It is the anatomy of power itself. Institutions cannot admit weakness. Monarchs cannot show decay. And so, a great conspiracy of silence rose around Henry's bed, a wall of lies built to shield the people from reality. In that silence, the seeds of manipulation were planted, seeds that would shape England long after Henry's body was lowered into the ground. Because this is how control survives, not by truth, but by illusion. Not by showing the king as he is, but by painting him as he was. A corpse may rot in secret, but the image of power must endure. And in that image, the lie of Henry VIII still rules. By the final nights, Henry's body was no longer his prison, it was his executioner. Each movement tore open his ulcers, each breath rattled with the weight of drowning lungs. Physicians, desperate and terrified of failure, tried everything: poultices of boiled onions, powdered bone, even fragments of human skull. Nothing stopped the agony. Opium dulled the pain, but with it came visions, terrors that no crown could command away. Attendants wrote that he would wake screaming, clawing at the air, convinced he was surrounded. He saw them: the wives he discarded, the rivals he destroyed, the innocents he condemned. And Bullen, her eyes fixed and accusing. Catherine Howard, pleading for mercy he never gave. Thomas More, silent, unflinching. Their faces gathered at the foot of his bed, not in rebellion, not in defiance, but in judgment. Henry's throne could silence their tongues in life, but not their memory in death. It is here that the illusion of kingship disintegrates. Power can silence the living, but it cannot silence conscience. A man may bend nations, but when he lies in the dark with only his own mind for company, truth comes flooding in. Henry, who had declared himself God's chosen, who had executed bishops, lords, and even queens to maintain control, now faced the one tribunal from which he could not escape: himself. Some nights, he demanded Catholic rites, the rituals of the faith he once abandoned. Other nights, he proclaimed his loyalty to the Protestant reforms he himself had unleashed. He oscillated, desperate, afraid, searching for an anchor as eternity crept closer. His chaplains recorded his terror, how he would beg forgiveness in the quiet hours, only to rage again when the daylight returned. His faith, like his flesh, was decomposing. And here is the forbidden truth: Henry VIII was not dying as a king. He was dying as a man stripped bare, terrified, delirious, begging shadows for mercy. The grandeur, the portraits, the myth of the mighty Tudor lion, all of it rotted away with the pus that seeped from his body. What remained was fear. Pause, and consider this: what would you see in your final hours if all illusions were stripped away? What ghosts would stand at the foot of your bed? If you are still here, still listening, I want you to prove something, to yourself, not to me. In the comments, write the phrase, "the crown rot within," twice. Do it to seal this moment, to mark that you are not just consuming history, but becoming aware of what it truly means. Because once you see through illusion, you can never go back. The truth of Henry's death was not only hidden within the sickroom, it was weaponized. The men who gathered outside those velvet curtains understood one thing: the king's collapse was an opportunity. His body was breaking, but his crown was still intact. And whoever controlled the crown controlled England. The Privy Council moved in shadows, sworn to secrecy. They told the people their king was hale and hearty, even as he convulsed in seizures and soiled his bed with the fluids of decay. For 3 days after his final breath, they hid the fact of his death entirely. Why? Because power cannot afford chaos. To announce his death too soon would have been to invite war, between Catholics and Protestants, between nobles and rivals, between England and its enemies abroad. And so the truth was gagged, smothered under ritual, sealed behind silence. Meanwhile, inside the palace, death became logistics. The king's corpse, bloated and unstable, decomposed so quickly that embalmers struggled to keep up. Organs were removed, the cavities stuffed with herbs, but even this desperate alchemy could not disguise the truth. His body expanded until the lead-lined coffin itself split under the pressure, fluid seeping out onto the chapel floor. Witnesses whispered of dogs licking at the seepage, a grotesque final indignity for the man who had demanded absolute majesty. Yet while the body leaked, the image remained untouchable. The funeral procession did not show the swollen tyrant, but an effigy of the golden prince he had once been, broad-shouldered, defiant, eternal. The people mourned a symbol, not a man. They mourned the illusion carefully crafted by artists like Hans Holbein, an image more powerful than truth itself. And here lies the deeper revelation: institutions are not built on reality. They are built on image. On narrative. The crown was never about Henry's flesh, never about the ulcers or the rot. It was about the myth of Henry, the embodiment of England's strength. When his body collapsed, the institution simply replaced reality with propaganda. The lie outlived the man. This is why forbidden history is dangerous. Because if you learn to see through the illusions of yesterday, you begin to see the illusions of today. And once you realize that power survives by disguising weakness, by covering rot with gold, you start to understand the world you live in was built the exact same way. The question is not why Henry's death was hidden. The question is, what truths are being hidden from you, right now? Even as Henry's breath rattled to an end, his hand reached beyond the grave. His will, 30 pages long, drafted with obsessive precision, was his last attempt to command the kingdom. It dictated succession, first to his son Edward, then to Mary, then to Elizabeth. It created a regency council of 16 men to, collectively, guide the realm until young Edward reached 18. On the surface, it was balance. In reality, it was desperation, a king trying to freeze the future, to hold power even when his flesh had turned to dust. But the moment Henry's eyes closed, that will was nothing more than paper. Power does not obey ink when ambition sharpens its knives. Edward Seymour, uncle to the boy king, moved faster than the rest. Within days he outmaneuvered the other councillors, had himself named Lord Protector, and seized control of England in his nephew's name. Henry's carefully constructed balance crumbled instantly. His words carried no force once the man who spoke them was gone. This is the paradox of absolute rulers: their power exists only while they breathe. When they die, the vultures descend. The crown may pass to an heir, but the machinery beneath it belongs to whoever dares to take it. Henry believed he could bind the future with signatures, seals, and divine declarations. Instead, he became the perfect example of how fragile even the mightiest throne is when it is no longer backed by fear. But here's the darker truth: Henry's death did not weaken the system. It revealed it. England did not mourn a man. England mourned an illusion, the towering figure painted in oil and marble, not the decayed husk left behind in Whitehall. The myth survived, stronger than the body, because myths do not bleed. And that myth became the vessel through which new men seized power. Look closely and you'll see the pattern. Institutions use flesh as scaffolding, but they survive by image. A king dies, but the crown endures. A body rots, but the propaganda remains untouchable. And in that gap, between what is real and what is remembered, lies control. Henry VIII tried to rule England from beyond the grave. But what really ruled England after him was the lie of his strength. And men like Edward Seymour knew it. They didn't protect the truth. They buried it, because truth destabilizes, but myth commands obedience. Henry's death was not just a medical event. It was a spectacle, a parable carved into flesh. His body told the truth his courtiers dared not speak. Look closely, a man once hailed as Europe's golden prince now reduced to a mountain of rotting meat. A king who had commanded armies now required winches to lift him from his bed. A ruler who demanded reverence now filled his chambers with a stench so overpowering that attendants gagged behind perfumed cloths. This was not coincidence. This was symbol. The ulcers devouring his legs were more than disease, they were prophecy. They revealed what unchecked power does to a man, how it swells, how it festers, how it finally bursts. Henry's body was England in miniature, swollen with excess, bleeding from corruption, poisoned by ambition. His flesh became a metaphor for the empire he tried to shape, grand, brutal, yet crumbling beneath its own weight. But the most haunting truth was this: Henry's collapse did not humble him. Even as he drowned in pus and fever, he clung to control. He dictated who would enter his chamber. He demanded silence about his condition. He signed death warrants while barely able to hold the pen. He still believed he was master of the storm, even as the storm dragged him under. And yet, the storm is not what killed him. What killed him was illusion. The illusion that power is permanent. The illusion that crowns can command eternity. The illusion that flesh, swollen with indulgence and corruption, can resist the universal law, all things decay. Henry's downfall was not just physical. It was cosmic. It was the inevitable consequence of believing himself untouchable. Think about the images the world remembers: Henry painted by Holbein, standing broad, chest out, legs planted wide, hands on hips. The embodiment of dominance. But that image is the greatest lie of all. Because the real Henry, the Henry who matters, was the one rotting in the shadows, delirious, begging forgiveness from ghosts no one else could see. And here is the forbidden lesson: the body always tells the truth. The mask may command obedience, but the flesh reveals the cost. And if you want to understand power, do not study the portraits. Study the ulcers. Study the coffin that split open. Study the silence that smothered the truth. Henry VIII did not die as a lion. He died as a carcass. And that is what power does: when it devours itself. When the king was finally dead, the real horror began. The council had one task: to bury him quickly, quietly, and with dignity. But how do you disguise the collapse of a man who had believed himself divine? How do you turn rot into majesty? They tried. They embalmed what they could. They dressed him in robes of crimson and gold. They sealed him inside a coffin of lead, hoping to contain the ruin. Yet within days the corpse swelled, gases pushing against the coffin until the wood cracked. The king who had broken kingdoms now broke his own coffin. And then, the unthinkable, fluid seeped out, dripping onto the floor of Sion Abbey where the coffin had been set overnight. Dogs were said to have lapped at the leaking matter. Whether myth or truth, the story spread like wildfire, a warning whispered from servant to servant, that God himself had judged Henry. Still, the show had to go on. His funeral procession stretched for miles, banners fluttering, thousands marching, drums thundering. But notice this: the people were not shown his body. They were shown an effigy, a carved, painted likeness of Henry in his prime. The strong-jawed tyrant. The undefeated king. The mask of majesty. That effigy lay atop the coffin, carried high, while inside the box the reality festered unseen. The people mourned the image, not the truth. And in that dissonance, a new myth was forged. The effigy became memory. The leaking coffin became rumor. And between them, history itself fractured. Was Henry a lion or a beast? A god or a carcass? The answer depended on which story you were allowed to hear. But listen closer. There was a deeper conspiracy in the burial. Henry had demanded to be laid beside Jane Seymour, his true wife, the only queen who gave him a son. But was this love? Or was it possession? Even in death, he sought to control women, to arrange his own narrative. His body was placed in Windsor, under layers of stone, as if the weight of the cathedral could crush the truth beneath it. Yet the legend only grew heavier. The coffin leaked. The abbey stank. The dogs licked. The whispers spread. And in those whispers, Henry was transformed, not into the eternal king he demanded to be, but into a warning, that power cannot disguise corruption forever. That even kings rot. And that rot, once exposed, becomes history's sharpest weapon. In the end, Henry VIII's death was not the fall of a man, but the unveiling of a system. His body rotted. His coffin split. His memory fractured. But the crown endured. And this is the most terrifying truth: power does not die with the tyrant. It mutates. It changes form. It sheds one body and inhabits another. Like a parasite, it survives on belief, on fear, on myth. Henry believed he could rule from beyond the grave, that his will, his seals, his legacy would hold England in his grip. Instead, his death proved the opposite. The second his breath stopped, the scavengers descended. Seymour seized the reins. The council schemed. The people mourned an effigy, not a corpse. The system consumed him and then moved on, hungrier than before. And what about the people who lived under his shadow? They learned a lesson without ever speaking it aloud, that what they are shown is never the truth. They saw a king painted as invincible while his legs oozed pus. They saw a glorious funeral while his coffin leaked filth. They saw banners of gold masking a regime of fear. The performance was perfect, but the stench was stronger. The lie was mighty, but the truth leaked out. Here is the forbidden knowledge: every empire is built on this same deception. Power wears a mask. The mask demands obedience. But behind it, always, is the rotting body. The question is never whether leaders are strong. The question is always how long before the coffin cracks. And so Henry's story becomes prophecy. Today's kings, presidents, CEOs, and tyrants all wear their own effigies, smiling portraits, polished speeches, curated images. But look closely. The ulcers are there. The cracks are forming. The mask is slipping. And just like Henry, they will be remembered not for their portraits, but for the truth their flesh could not conceal. That is why Henry's death still matters. Not because he was unique, but because he was universal. He is the eternal warning that power cannot escape decay. That myths are powerful, but rot is stronger. That the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always seep out. So remember this: every mask you see, every image of strength, every perfect performance, look for the coffin beneath it. Look for the cracks. Look for the stench. Because when it leaks, you will finally see what power truly is.